What are planning obligations? Well, a planning obligation is a legal agreement whereby a developer will mitigate or compensate for the harmful impacts of a new development. Now, development delivers the homes, schools, shops, transport facilities and employment places that people need, but development also has a potential to create negative pressures on the community and the environment. More traffic, more congestion, more pollution, more disturbance, the loss of facilities and amenities, or rising land values and rents, squeezing out those who don't own land or buildings or can't afford to stay. Planning obligations are there to enable development to happen, but also to ensure that any harm that results is removed or reduced to an acceptable level. In particular, they enable the provision of the infrastructure needed to support development, such as roads, public transport, open space, schools, health facilities, and affordable housing. Who signs up to planning obligations? When a developer submits a planning application, the council assesses the actions required to minimise the impacts of the proposed development and negotiates with the developer to pay for all or part of this work. Planning obligations are agreed before work on a development starts and are set out in a legally binding contract known as the Section 106 agreement, and that's between the council and the developer. Councils can use planning obligations to ensure a development is in line with council policies, for example, by requiring a proportion of affordable housing, to mitigate the impact of development by contributing to the extension of a local school, to provide for families moving into a new development, or to compensate for loss or damage caused by a development by replacing wildlife habitats or open space which is built on. Planning obligations can restrict how land is developed or used, require a developer to take certain actions, require a developer to make payments to the council or another body to provide facilities or services. When a council considers whether a planning obligation is appropriate, it has to apply 5 tests, which are set out in legislation and in government policy. 1. Planning obligations have to be directly related to the development. Most councils interpret this as meaning that planning obligation monies have to be spent on or near the development. Others also include items that residents of the new development will use, such as leisure centres or parks. 2. The scale of obligations needs to be appropriate to the proposed development. Small developments will contribute less in planning obligations than larger developments. For example, whilst the developer of one shop might be required to contribute towards a new cycle path, the developer of a new shopping complex will be asked to pay for a whole transport network to enable people to shop without using their cars. 3. Planning obligations should be necessary to bring the development in line with the council's policies, i.e., the development without the planning obligations would have to be refused. 4. Planning obligations cannot cover issues which are not dealt with through the planning process. For instance, replacing the boiler in the local vicarage is not relevant to the planning process, so could not be funded through planning obligations. 5. Planning obligations have to be reasonable. For instance, they cannot be used to provide facilities at a private tennis club where only selected members will benefit. It is for the developer and council, and ultimately the courts, to negotiate what is deemed to be reasonable. Once planning permission has been granted, it can take many months to sign the Section 106 agreement, as legal teams for the council and developer negotiate the details of the agreement. Although the government guidance in Circular 05/05 Planning Obligations, paragraph B42 to 43, states that planning authorities should publish draft planning agreements. In practice, few do. It is worth inquiring and referring them to the circular, sections B41 to 45, cover public involvement if they try to suggest that they're not obliged to. This and a lot more information about the S106 agreements can be gained from this booklet, The No Pain Guide to Gain, a community guide to planning obligations. Just search for it online.